A mail-order bride arrives at a dusty western town with 3 small children in tow, her heart full of hope from months of correspondence with a cattle baron seeking a wife, only to face cruel rejection when he discovers the triplets she never mentioned in her letters. But as she stands abandoned at the station platform with her world crumbling around her, a wealthy rancher steps from the crowd, recognition dawning in his eyes. The woman he once loved in his youth, thought lost too. Him forever, now returned to his life when she needs him most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Caroline Blackwood clutched the well-worn stack of letters in one hand and steadied her sleeping 4-month-old daughter Lily against her shoulder with the other. The train's whistle pierced the air as it began its final approach to Prosperity Springs, Colorado. Through the soot-streaked window, she glimpsed a cluster of buildings rising from the rugged landscape like wooden islands in a sea of prairie grass and distant mountains. "Almost there," she whispered to the 3 infants. Thomas and James, Lily's brothers, dozed in their shared travel bassinet, remarkably peaceful despite the train's constant rocking and clattering. The triplets had been surprisingly good travelers considering the circumstances. The grueling 5-day journey from Philadelphia, changing trains twice, sleeping in stations when necessary, and enduring curious glances and whispered comments from fellow passengers. At 26, Caroline had exhausted all options in Philadelphia. The small inheritance from her parents had dwindled to nothing after her husband Frederick's sudden death from pneumonia just weeks before the triplets' birth. The modest boarding house where she'd taken a room had made it clear that 3 wailing infants were more disruption than their other tenants could bear, regardless of how diligently she tried to quiet them. The newspaper advertisement had seemed like divine providence. Established rancher of means seeks educated Eastern lady for matrimony. Position offers security and respectable standing in growing township. References provided. Caroline touched the wedding band she still wore. More for propriety's sake now than sentiment. Frederick had been kind enough, though their arranged marriage had been more practical than passionate. His family's financial reversals after their wedding had destroyed the security she'd married for. She unfolded the top letter from Josiah Thornton, careful not to disturb Lily. His penmanship was bold and confident, just as she imagined the man himself would be. Over 3 months of correspondence, Thornton had described his successful cattle operation, his prominent position on the town council, and his desire for companionship after 10 years as a widower. He'd written about wanting to build a family legacy, though Caroline had been carefully vague about already having children in her responses. She'd decided that such news would be better delivered in person after Thornton had a chance to meet her. Now, with Prosperity Springs seconds away, doubt gnawed at her confidence. Would he be angry about the triplets? Would he reject her outright? She'd spent her last dollars on this journey, selling her mother's silver hairbrush and her own. Books to fund the train tickets and necessary supplies for the babies. There was no turning back. The train lurched to a halt with a screech of brakes and billowing steam. The sudden stop woke James, who began to fuss, his tiny face scrunching in preparation for a full-throated cry. Caroline quickly rocked the bassinet with her foot while adjusting Lily on her shoulder, a balancing act she'd perfected in recent months. "Final stop! Prosperity Springs!" the conductor called, making his way through the car. "All passengers disembark!" Other travelers gathered their belongings, but Caroline remained seated, overwhelmed by the logistics of managing 3 infants and her single carpet bag simultaneously. As the car emptied, the conductor approached, his expression softening when he noticed her predicament. "Need some assistance, ma'am?" he asked, twisting his weathered cap in calloused hands. "Yes, please," Caroline replied gratefully. "If you could carry the bassinet while I manage my daughter and the bag." The conductor nodded, carefully lifting the bassinet containing the two boys. Visitors to Prosperity Springs? New residents? Hopefully, Caroline said, standing carefully with Lily still sleeping against her shoulder. I'm expected. The platform was busy with activity. Passengers reuniting with waiting family members, workers unloading mail and freight, horses, and wagons stirring dust in the late afternoon sun. Caroline scanned the crowd anxiously, searching for a man who matched Josiah Thornton's description. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a distinguished beard going silver at the edges. Mrs. Blackwood? Caroline turned toward the voice. The man approaching matched Thornton's description perfectly, dressed in a well-tailored suit that set him apart from the more roughly clothed townspeople. His confident stride faltered slightly as his gaze moved from her face to Lily, then to the bassinet the conductor held. "Mr. Thornton?" she asked, her heart racing. "Yes." His response was clipped, nothing like the warm tone she'd imagined while reading his letters. He stared at the babies with undisguised shock. "What is this?" Caroline swallowed hard. "These are my children, Thomas, James, and Lily. They're 4 months old." Thornton's expression hardened, his earlier shock calcifying into something colder. "You made no mention of children in your letters, Mrs. Blackwood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I thought it best to explain in person," Caroline replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "They're well-behaved babies, and I'm accustomed to caring for them without assistance." Several onlookers had paused to observe the uncomfortable exchange. The conductor shifted awkwardly, still holding the bassinet with the two boys, who were now both awake and gurgling. 3 infants, Thornton stated flatly. "You brought 3 infants to a cattle ranch in Colorado Territory without so much as a warning." "I understood you wanted a family," Caroline countered, desperation edging into her voice. "You wrote of building a legacy. A legacy of my own making, Mrs. Blackwood, not raising another man's children." Thornton glanced around, aware of the growing audience. He lowered his voice. "This arrangement won't work. I sought a wife to manage my household and provide suitable companionship, not a ready-made family of 4. The reality of her situation crashed down on Caroline. She had gambled everything on this opportunity, and in moments it had disintegrated before her eyes. "What am I to do, then?" she asked, dignity battling with despair. "I've spent everything I had to come here." Thornton's face registered brief discomfort, quickly masked by cool detachment. "There's a hotel down the street. I'll pay for 2 nights' lodging after that." He shrugged slightly. "I'm sure you're resourceful." Before Caroline could respond, a woman pushed through the small crowd that had gathered, her practical brown dress and sturdy boots covered in a fine layer of prairie dust. Her grey-streaked brown hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, but her face was kind, despite its weathered appearance. "Everything all right here, Josiah?" she asked, though her gaze was fixed on Caroline and the triplets. "A misunderstanding, Mrs. Foster," Thornton replied stiffly. "This is Mrs. Blackwood, from Philadelphia. There were details left unmentioned in our correspondence." Mrs. Foster's eyes narrowed slightly at Thornton before softening as she turned to Caroline. "Those little ones are nearly frozen, poor things. The spring evenings still carry winter's bite out here." Caroline nodded gratefully at this small kindness. "Yes, they're not accustomed to the mountain air." "I'll handle this, Martha," Thornton interrupted. "I've offered Mrs. Blackwood lodging at the hotel for 2 nights until she can make other arrangements." "The Prosperity Springs Hotel?" Mrs. Foster snorted. "That drafty old place? The gaps between the floorboards are wide enough to lose a cat through. No place for babies." She turned fully toward Caroline. "I'm Martha Foster. I run the boarding house at the edge of town. Clean, warm and quiet enough that those little ones can rest properly. The unexpected offer of assistance nearly broke Caroline's carefully maintained composure. That's very kind, but I'm afraid my funds are quite limited after the journey. We can discuss that later, Martha said firmly. Right now, those babies need warmth, and you look dead on your feet yourself. Thornton cleared his throat. As I said, I'll cover 2 nights' lodging. That's mighty generous of you, Josiah, Martha interrupted, her tone suggesting it was anything but. I'm sure your conscience is much relieved. She turned back to Caroline. My son Daniel has a wagon outside. He can bring your trunk. Just this carpetbag and the bassinet, Caroline replied, embarrassed by her meager possessions. Martha's expression softened further. Then we're all set. Come along, dear. The sun will be setting soon, and the temperature drops quick in these parts. Caroline found herself following Martha away from the station, away from Josiah Thornton and his broken promises, toward an uncertain future in a town where she knew no one. The triplets seemed to sense her distress, all 3 becoming increasingly fussy, their small sounds of discomfort visible as puffs of breath in the cooling air. The Foster boarding house was a large 2-story structure with a wide porch and windows glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. Martha led Caroline inside to a comfortable sitting room where a fire crackled in a stone hearth. The modest but clean furnishings and the smell of fresh bread created an immediate sense of welcome that brought tears to Caroline's eyes after the long journey and humiliating rejection. "Daniel!" Martha called. A young man of perhaps 18 appeared from a back room, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Get some warm water for these babies and bring up the old cradle from the storage room." "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his curious gaze lingering briefly on Caroline and the triplets before. He hurried to fulfill his mother's requests. "Now let me hold one of these little angels while you warm yourself," Martha offered, already reaching for Lily. Too exhausted to protest, Caroline surrendered her daughter to the older woman's capable hands. Martha expertly cradled Lily, examining her with experienced eyes. Beautiful babies, all 3, so small still but bright-eyed. She looked up at Caroline. "Triplets are a blessing and a challenge. You've done well to get them this far by yourself." "Thank you," Caroline whispered, relishing the moment of relief as she sat in a rocking chair near the fire. "They were born early and tiny, but they've grown stronger each day. And their names?" "Thomas, James, and Lily," Caroline replied, indicating each child. "Thomas and James for their grandfathers, and Lily for my mother, Lillian." Martha nodded approvingly, bouncing slightly as Lily began to fuss. "Good, strong names with history behind them." Her expression grew serious. "Now, about Josiah Thornton." Caroline sighed. "I should have been forthright about the children in my letters. It was wrong to withhold such important information, but I feared he would reject my application outright." "And he might have," Martha acknowledged. "Thornton's a prominent businessman here, but he's always been more concerned with appearances than substance. His sudden interest in finding an Eastern bride had more to do with impressing his business associates than genuine companionship." The front door opened, bringing a blast of cold air and a tall man in a heavy coat dusted with road dust. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, and a face weathered by sun and wind, yet handsome in its strong features. His eyes, a startling shade of green, moved from Martha to Caroline with undisguised surprise. "Evening, Martha. Didn't expect company," he said, his deep voice carrying a slight accent Caroline couldn't immediately place. "Unexpected developments, Jackson," Martha replied. "This is Mrs. Caroline Blackwood and her triplets, just arrived from Philadelphia. Mrs. Blackwood, my brother-in-law, Jackson Foster." Caroline noticed the man freeze momentarily as Martha said her name, his expression shifting from polite interest to intense focus. "Caroline, Caroline Miller from Haverford," he asked, using her maiden name. Stunned, Caroline studied his face more carefully, searching for familiarity in the weathered features. Recognition dawned slowly. Jackson Foster from my father's academy?" A smile transformed his serious face. "It's been, what, 8 years? 9? 10, Caroline corrected, memories flooding back. Jackson Foster had been one of her father's most promising students at the small academy for young men he'd run in Pennsylvania. Unlike the wealthy sons of Philadelphia society who comprised most of the student body, Jackson had been a scholarship student, brilliant but from humble origins. He disappeared suddenly in Caroline's 16th year, rumored to have gone west to seek his fortune. "You two know each other?" Martha asked, looking between them with obvious curiosity. "Jackson was my father's student," Caroline explained, still processing this extraordinary coincidence. "He excelled in mathematics and natural philosophy." "And Caroline was the headmaster's daughter," Jackson added, his eyes never leaving her face. "Forbidden territory for students, but admired from afar by many of us nonetheless." A shadow crossed his features. "I was sorry to hear about your parents. Cholera, wasn't it?" "Yes, 3 years ago," Caroline confirmed, surprised he knew. "How did you—" "I maintained correspondence with Professor Miller until his passing," Jackson explained. "He was a significant influence in my life." He glanced at the triplets with undisguised curiosity. "And you married?" "Frederick Blackwood," Caroline supplied. "He passed away before the children were born." Understanding and sympathy filled Jackson's eyes. "I see." He removed his coat, revealing the fine quality of his clothing beneath. Not ostentatious, but well-made and clearly expensive. "And Thornton was to be your second husband," Martha interjected before Caroline could respond, "until he saw the triplets. Apparently, 3 babies weren't part of his vision for an advantageous marriage." Jackson's expression darkened momentarily. "That sounds like Thornton, always calculating the ledger before considering the human element." Daniel returned with a basin of warm water and news that he'd set up the cradle in the blue room upstairs. Caroline seized the opportunity to attend to the babies, grateful for a moment to compose herself after the shock of encountering someone from her past in this remote place. With Martha's help, she bathed and changed the triplets, fed them from bottles she'd prepared before the train's arrival, and settled them in the surprisingly spacious cradle. All 3 drifted to sleep almost immediately, exhausted from the journey. "They'll likely sleep through dinner," Martha observed. "Come downstairs and have a proper meal. You look ready to collapse yourself." Downstairs, Caroline found a simple but hearty dinner laid out. Roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and early spring greens. Jackson had removed his traveling clothes and now wore a clean shirt. His hair still damp from washing, the transformation made him look more like the young man she remembered, though he'd grown from a lanky student into a broad-shouldered, confident man. "You're settled in Colorado now?" Caroline asked as Martha served the meal. "I never expected to encounter anyone from Pennsylvania here." "Life takes unexpected turns," Jackson replied. "After leaving the academy, I worked my way west, railroad construction, mining camps, cattle drives. Eventually won a small parcel of land in a poker game near Prosperity Springs." A smile touched his lips. "Turned out that worthless parcel had excellent water access. I expanded over time, and now the Triple F ranch covers nearly 10,000 acres. Martha snorted good-naturedly. "What my modest brother-in-law isn't telling you is that he's now one of the wealthiest ranchers in the territory. The Triple F employs 30 men year-round and ships beef as far as Chicago." Caroline's eyes widened. "That's remarkable. The triple F stands for Foster Family Futures, Jackson explained. Named in honor of my late brother, Frank, Martha's husband. He died in a flash flood 5 years after we established the ranch. Since then, Martha's kept the books and managed the household, while I handle the cattle and business affairs. Jackson provided for Daniel's education and my security after Frank died, Martha added. Family takes care of family here in the West. Speaking of which, she turned her attention fully to Caroline. What will you do now, dear? The question hung heavily in the air. Caroline set down her fork, appetite diminishing as reality reasserted itself. I don't know, she admitted. My plan was entirely dependent on Mr. Thornton. I have minimal funds remaining, 3 infants to care for, and no connections here beyond. She glanced at Jackson, an unexpected familiar face. You mentioned you were a teacher in Philadelphia? Jackson asked. Yes, at Miss Porter's Academy for Young Ladies before my marriage. I taught literature, French, and basic sciences. Jackson nodded thoughtfully. Prosperity Springs has grown considerably in recent years. Many families have settled, bringing children who need education beyond what their parents can provide. The town council has discussed establishing a proper school, but finding qualified teachers willing to come west has been challenging. Hope flickered briefly in Caroline's chest before reality extinguished it. Even if such a position were available, I have the triplets to consider. No school would hire a teacher with 3 infants requiring constant attention. Perhaps not a traditional school arrangement, Jackson acknowledged. But there are families on outlying ranches and farms whose children cannot easily travel to town daily. They might value a governess or tutor. The possibility hadn't occurred to Caroline. Do you really think there would be interest in such an arrangement? I know several families who would consider it, Martha confirmed. The Hendersons have 5 children they're currently attempting to educate themselves, with mixed results, and the Wilsons' daughters are approaching an age where finishing skills would be valuable. Caroline considered this option. Even so, I would need accommodation that allows for the triplets, and I doubt private tutoring would immediately provide enough for rent and necessities. Jackson and Martha exchanged a glance that contained some unspoken communication. There is another possibility, Jackson said carefully. The Triple F has a cottage that originally served as the foreman's quarters before we built the new bunkhouse. It's been used for storage recently, but could be easily converted back to a comfortable dwelling. You could establish your teaching practice from there, with the ranch as your base. Caroline stared at him, taken aback by the generous offer. That's extraordinarily kind, but I couldn't possibly accept such charity. Not charity, Jackson corrected firmly. The Triple F would benefit from having an educated presence. Many of our cowhands never had proper schooling. Reading contracts, calculating figures. These skills would make them more valuable employees. You could provide basic instruction to interested ranch hands in exchange for lodging. It's a practical solution, Martha added. The cottage is far enough from the main house for privacy, but close enough that I could assist with the triplets when needed. The offer seemed almost too perfect, raising Caroline's suspicions. Why would you extend such an opportunity to someone you barely know? Jackson's green eyes held hers steadily. I knew your father as a man of integrity, who gave me a chance when others wouldn't. The Academy scholarship changed my life trajectory. Perhaps this is my opportunity to honor that debt. There was something unspoken in his expression, something beyond simple gratitude, but Caroline was too exhausted to decipher it. The practical arrangement solved her most pressing concerns: shelter, income potential, and assistance with the children. I would need to consider your offer carefully, she said finally. Perhaps visit this cottage to better understand what would be involved. Of course, Jackson agreed immediately. We can ride out tomorrow after you've rested. The ranch is about 4 miles from town. They arranged a time for the visit, and soon after, Caroline excused herself, the day's events catching up with her in a wave of bone-deep weariness. As Martha showed her to the room she would share with the triplets, the older woman squeezed her arm gently. "Jackson Foster is a good man," Martha said quietly. "One of the best I've known. Whatever your decision, you can trust his word." Left alone with her sleeping children, Caroline sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process the extraordinary turn of events. That morning, she had been traveling toward what she believed would be a secure, if loveless, marriage. By afternoon, she had faced humiliating rejection, and now, through an almost impossible coincidence, she had encountered someone from her past, someone who had apparently prospered beyond imagination in the intervening years. Was this divine providence, or merely another false hope? The question followed her into uneasy dreams, where Jackson Foster's green eyes and Josiah Thornton's cold dismissal blended with memories of her father's academy and the weight of 3 small lives depending entirely on her decisions. Morning brought clarity and new developments. Caroline awoke to find the triplets unusually peaceful, all 3 watching the patterns of spring sunlight dancing across the bedroom wall. After feeding and changing them, she carried them downstairs to find Martha preparing breakfast and Jackson already seated at the table discussing ranch business with his nephew. "Good morning," Jackson greeted her, rising automatically. His eyes warmed at the sight of the triplets. "They look bright-eyed after their journey." "They're resilient," Caroline replied, settling Lily in her arm while placing Thomas and James in a makeshift nest of blankets Martha had prepared on a bench seat. "More adaptable than I expected." "Like their mother," Martha commented, serving plates of eggs, bacon, and freshly baked bread. "Traveling halfway across the country alone with 3 infants takes courage most men wouldn't attempt." Caroline felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected praise. "Necessity is a powerful motivator." "Indeed," Jackson agreed, his expression thoughtful, as he studied her. "After breakfast, I've asked Daniel to drive us out to the ranch in the wagon. The roads are still muddy from spring thaw, and it would be difficult to manage the triplets on horseback." The practical consideration touched Caroline. In her experience, most men gave little thought to the logistics of traveling with infants. Frederick, though not unkind, had been perpetually baffled by the basic requirements of childcare. As they ate, Martha described the community of Prosperity Springs, the church that served multiple denominations on rotating Sundays, the General Store run by the Wilkerson family for 3 generations, the new doctor who had arrived from Denver the previous autumn. Caroline listened attentively, recognizing the importance of understanding the town's dynamics if she were to build a life there. "And what of Mr. Thornton?" she asked finally, needing to gauge his influence in the community she might join. "Is he likely to make things difficult if I remain in Prosperity Springs?" Jackson and Martha exchanged glances before Martha answered carefully. "Josiah wields considerable influence through his cattle business and the mercantile he owns in town. Some residents depend on his goodwill for their livelihoods." She paused, considering her next words. "But he's not universally beloved. His business practices are sometimes questionable." "Thornton came west with nothing and built his empire through determination and calculated risks," Jackson added. "I respect his accomplishments while questioning some of his methods. We've been both business partners and rivals at different times." "What Martha isn't saying," Daniel interjected with the directness of youth, "is that Mr. Thornton tried to block Uncle Jackson's water rights claim 3 years ago, nearly ruined the Triple F before it really got established." "Daniel," Martha cautioned, but Jackson waved away her concern. "It's true enough," he acknowledged. Thornton doesn't appreciate competition, especially from someone he considers an outsider to the territory. Yet you've succeeded despite his opposition, Caroline observed. A smile briefly transformed Jackson's serious features. The academy taught me many things, including the importance of having irrefutable documentation when facing powerful adversaries. After breakfast, Daniel brought the wagon around, and Martha helped Caroline prepare the triplets for the journey, providing extra blankets to protect against the cool morning air. The drive to the Triple F ranch took nearly an hour along rutted roads, still soft from spring melt. Caroline held Lily, while Jackson surprisingly volunteered to secure the bassinet with the boys between them on the wagon seat. As they crested a small rise, the Triple F ranch came into view, and Caroline caught her breath at the unexpected scale of the operation. A substantial two-story main house of dressed stone and timber anchored the property with a cluster of outbuildings organized around a central courtyard. Beyond stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed, and in the distance the foothills of the Rocky Mountains provided a dramatic backdrop. "It's beautiful," Caroline said softly. "It was rough country when Frank and I first claimed it," Jackson replied, his voice reflecting pride tempered with humility. "Took years of hard work to transform it into what you see now." Daniel guided the wagon toward the main house, where several ranch hands paused in their work to observe the newcomers with undisguised curiosity. A tall, grey-haired man in worn denims and a leather vest approached as they halted. "Mrs. Blackwood, this is Mr. Callahan, our foreman," Jackson introduced them as he helped her down from the wagon. "Cal, Mrs. Blackwood and her children are considering taking up residence in the old foreman's cottage." Callahan touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Ma'am, those little ones all yours?" "Yes, triplets," Caroline confirmed, growing accustomed to the direct curiosity of Westerners. 4 months old now." Callahan whistled low. "Triple blessing and triple challenge, I'd wager. My missus had twins 30 years back, and that nearly did us in." His weathered face creased in a smile. "Course, those boys are both riding for the Triple F now, so it worked out in the end." The easy acceptance in the foreman's manner reassured Caroline more than any formal welcome could have. Jackson seemed to sense her relief, his hand briefly touching her elbow in a gesture of support as he guided her toward a path leading away from the main house. "The cottage is this way," he explained, "about 500 yards from the main house, close enough for convenience but distant enough for privacy." The structure that came into view surprised Caroline. Rather than the rough cabin she had envisioned, the cottage was a well-built one-story dwelling with a covered porch wrapping around 2 sides. Though clearly unused for some time, its bones were sound, the roof intact and windows unbroken. "It's much larger than I expected," Caroline remarked as Jackson opened the door. "The original foreman had 6 children," he explained. "We built it to accommodate his family." Inside, the cottage was dusty but spacious, a main living area with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove, 2 bedrooms, and an additional small room that might serve as a nursery. Furniture draped in protective cloth suggested the space could be made habitable with minimal effort. "With some cleaning and minor repairs, this could be quite comfortable," Jackson said, watching her reaction carefully. "The roof is sound. The chimney was cleaned last autumn, and there's a good well just 50 yards away. The stove might need new fire bricks, but otherwise is serviceable." Caroline walked the room slowly, mentally arranging the space, where the triplets would sleep, where she might set up a teaching area, how to make the most of the natural light from the east-facing windows. Despite her caution, hope began to blossom. "You mentioned teaching the ranch hands in exchange for lodging," she said, turning to face Jackson. "What specifically did you have in mind?" Basic literacy and numeracy, for those interested, perhaps 2 evenings weekly, he replied. Many of our hands can sign their names, but struggle with reading contracts or calculating their due pay. It creates unnecessary misunderstandings and disadvantages them in their dealings in town. The practical nature of the arrangement appealed to Carolyn. Teaching useful skills rather than abstract knowledge had always been her preference, even at Miss Porter's academy. "And I would be free to establish tutoring arrangements with area families," she confirmed. "Absolutely. You'd have complete independence to build your own teaching practice. The Triple F would simply provide a stable base from which to operate." As they continued discussing logistics, Lily began to fuss, quickly joined by her brothers. The feeding schedule Caroline had maintained on the journey had been disrupted by the morning's activities. "They're hungry," she explained, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I should return to town to tend to them properly." "Of course," Jackson agreed immediately. "But if you're amenable, Martha packed a basket with provisions. You could feed the children here while I check on a matter with Callahan. Then we can discuss any additional questions on the return journey." The consideration in this offer, providing privacy while acknowledging practical needs, further impressed Caroline. Once alone with the triplets, she settled on a dusty but sturdy chair, alternating between feeding bottles prepared that morning and considering the unexpected opportunity before her. The cottage offered far more than mere shelter. It presented the possibility of independence, a chance to support herself and her children through her own skills rather than marriage to a stranger. Yet she couldn't help wondering about Jackson's motivations. Was this truly just repayment of a debt to her father, or something more? When Jackson returned an hour later, Carolyn had made her decision. "I would like to accept your offer of the cottage," she said, rising to meet him as he entered, "with one condition." "Name it," he replied, expression serious. "I insist on a formal rental arrangement. You'll establish fair compensation for the teaching services I provide to your ranch hands, and I'll pay a reasonable rent from those earnings. I won't be beholden to charity, however well-intentioned." Rather than offense, respect flashed in Jackson's green eyes. "Agreed. We'll draw up proper documentation to that effect." "When could we take occupancy?" Carolyn asked, practical, considerations already forming in her mind. "The cottage will need cleaning and some basic supplies before the children can stay overnight." "Martha and I anticipated you might accept," Jackson admitted. "She's already organizing a cleaning party of ranch wives for tomorrow. With their help, the cottage could be habitable by tomorrow evening. In the meantime, you're welcome to continue staying at the boarding house." As they prepared to leave, Jackson paused in the doorway, his expression suddenly reflective. "You know, your father once told me something I've never forgotten. He said, 'Education isn't just about books and figures, Foster. It's about equipping people to write their own stories rather than being minor characters in someone else's.'" The accurate recollection of her father's philosophy brought unexpected tears to Caroline's eyes. That sounds exactly like him. "You're writing a new chapter for yourself and your children," Jackson continued softly. "I'm honored to provide the paper, so to speak." The metaphor, somewhat awkward but heartfelt, solidified Caroline's confidence in her decision. Whatever complications might arise, whatever Josiah Thornton or others in Prosperity Springs might think of her unconventional situation, she had found an unexpected ally whose decency seemed genuine. As Daniel drove them back toward town, the triplets dozing in the spring sunshine, Caroline felt something she hadn't experienced since before Frederick's death. Not merely hope, but the beginnings of a plan that depended on her own abilities, rather than another's charity or obligation. For the first time since arriving in Colorado Territory, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she and her children might not just survive, but thrive. The following week passed in a whirlwind of activity as Caroline established herself and the triplets in their new home. True to Jackson's word, a group of ranch wives descended upon the cottage like a benevolent storm, scrubbing floors, washing windows, and transforming the dusty storage space into a welcoming home with astonishing efficiency. What might have taken Caroline weeks to accomplish alone was completed in a single day by these capable women who approached the task with the same determination they brought to all frontier challenges. Western women know the value of cooperation, Martha explained as she helped Caroline arrange the freshly cleaned furniture. When someone new joins our community, we all benefit from helping them succeed. Not all the help came from women. Jackson sent 3 ranch hands to repair the porch steps, replace broken window latches, and chop enough firewood to last a month. The foreman's wife, Mrs. Callahan, arrived with armloads of quilts and baby blankets that her grown children no longer needed. Even Daniel contributed, constructing a sturdy triplet cradle with 3 compartments that could be rocked with a single motion, an ingenious solution to a problem Caroline hadn't even articulated. "My father was a carpenter before trying his hand at ranching," he explained when Caroline marveled at his craftsmanship. "He taught me how to work wood almost before I could walk." On their 3rd day in the cottage, Caroline sat on the porch, rocking the triplets in their new cradle, marveling at how quickly her circumstances had transformed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard, where cowhands moved about their end-of-day chores. In the distance, a rider approached from the direction of town, the distinctive silhouette becoming recognizable as Jackson Foster. As he drew nearer, he dismounted smoothly, securing his horse to the porch rail before climbing the newly repaired steps. "Getting settled?" he asked, removing his hat as he approached. "More comfortably than I could have imagined," Caroline replied. "Everyone has been extraordinarily kind." Jackson settled into the 2nd rocking chair that someone had thoughtfully placed on the porch. "I've been in town arranging the documentation we discussed, a proper rental agreement and teaching contract." He produced several folded papers from his vest pocket. "I had Mr. Hargrove, the town attorney, draft them to ensure everything is legally sound." Caroline took the documents, touched by his attention to the formalities she had requested. The rental terms were fair, generous even, and the teaching arrangement clearly outlined reasonable expectations for both parties. "I also took the liberty of spreading word about your availability for private tutoring," Jackson continued. "The Hendersons are eager to discuss arrangements for their children, and Mrs. Wilson asked specifically about music instruction for her daughters." "Music?" Caroline looked up in surprise. "I never mentioned musical training." A flash of something crossed Jackson's features, embarrassment perhaps. "I remembered you played piano beautifully at your father's Christmas gatherings for the students. I hope I wasn't presumptuous." The fact that he remembered such a detail from more than a decade prior caught Caroline off guard. "No, not presumptuous. I'm quite capable of teaching basic piano and voice. I just didn't expect." She trailed off, uncertain how to express her surprise at being remembered so specifically. "I've also arranged for a small piano to be delivered next week," Jackson added. "It belonged to Martha's daughter who moved to Denver after marrying. It's been in storage at the main house." Caroline's eyes widened. "That's extraordinarily generous, but—" "It's a business investment," Jackson interrupted gently. "Musical instruction commands higher fees than basic subjects. The arrangement benefits the Triple F as your landlord." His framing of the gesture as practical rather than charitable helped Caroline accept it more easily, though she suspected there was more behind his generosity than he acknowledged. Before she could respond further, Lily began to fuss, followed almost immediately by her brothers in a now familiar cascade of escalating needs. "They're remarkably coordinated in their demands," Jackson observed with amusement. A survival strategy, I suspect, Caroline replied, reaching for Lily while rocking the cradle to soothe the boys. They've learned that sequential crying ensures each gets attention eventually, while simultaneous demands overwhelm me into addressing all three at once. Clever tacticians, Jackson commented. Without being asked, he reached down to continue rocking the cradle while Caroline attended to Lily. The easy, natural way he stepped in to help, without overstepping or making assumptions, stood in stark contrast to Josiah Thornton's cold rejection. "I should let you attend to your evening routine," Jackson said after a few moments. "I'll return tomorrow with news from the Hendersons about potential tutoring arrangements." As he prepared to leave, Caroline called after him, "Jackson!" He turned, eyebrows raised questioningly. "Thank you, not just for the practical assistance, but for seeing possibility where others saw only burden." Something softened in his expression. "Your father taught me to recognize potential others, overlooked. I'm simply following his example." With that, he mounted his horse and rode toward the main house, leaving Caroline to ponder the layers of meaning in their interaction. There was history between them. Not romantic history, as they had never been more than headmaster's daughter and scholarship student, but a shared understanding of where they had come from and the values that had shaped them. The following Sunday, Caroline attended services at Prosperity Springs Small Church, her first formal introduction to the wider community. Martha insisted on helping her prepare, arriving early at the cottage with a dress for Caroline that she had cleverly altered to allow for nursing the triplets discreetly if necessary. "First impressions matter in small towns," Martha explained as she pinned Caroline's hair into a simple but elegant style. "Some folks will judge you based on Thornton's rejection, others on your association with the Triple F, and most on how you present yourself and those beautiful babies." The church was already full when they arrived, the triplets dressed in matching white gowns that Mrs. Callahan had modified from her own children's christening clothes. Caroline felt dozens of curious gazes upon them as Martha led the way to a pew near the front, where Jackson and Daniel were already seated. Jackson rose immediately, taking Thomas from Caroline's arms to allow her to settle more easily with James and Lily. The simple act of assistance, performed with natural confidence before the watching congregation, sent a clear message of support that was not lost on the onlookers. As the service progressed, Caroline became aware of Josiah Thornton seated across the aisle, his expression impossible to read. He studiously avoided looking in their direction, though the woman beside him, his sister according to Martha's whispered explanation, made no such pretense, her critical gaze moving repeatedly between Caroline and Jackson with obvious disapproval. Following the service, Reverend Thomas, a kindly man with snow-white hair, made a point of welcoming Caroline personally. "Mrs. Blackwood, I understand you've taken up residence at the Triple F and will be offering educational services to our community. A most welcome addition." As the minister's wife cooed over the triplets, several families approached to introduce themselves. The Hendersons, robust farmers with 5 children ranging from 6 to 15, immediately arranged for Caroline to begin tutoring sessions the following week. Mrs. Wilson, a refined woman whose husband managed the region's most productive silver mine, inquired specifically about piano instruction for her 3 daughters. "My girls have a good ear but no formal training," she explained. "Denver society expects musical accomplishment, and they'll be entering that world all too soon." By the time they prepared to depart, Caroline had arranged for 6 potential students beyond the Triple F ranch hands, a promising start to her teaching practice. As Jackson helped settle the triplets in Martha's wagon for the return journey, Josiah Thornton approached, his sister hovering at his elbow. "Mrs. Blackwood," he acknowledged stiffly, "I see you've found arrangements." "Yes, Mr. Thornton," Caroline replied with careful politeness. "The community has been most welcoming. His gaze flickered briefly to Jackson, who had paused in his task but remained respectfully silent, allowing Caroline to manage the interaction herself. "Foster has always had a soft spot for strays," Thornton's sister remarked with artificial sweetness. "First those half-wild horses no one could break, then those Mexican farmhands no one would hire, and now—" She let the implication hang unfinished. "Miss Thornton," Jackson responded before Caroline could, his tone deceptively mild. "Mrs. Blackwood is an educated woman of considerable accomplishment who has chosen to grace our community with her presence and skills. Prosperity Springs is fortunate she remained despite her initial reception." The subtle rebuke caused Olivia Thornton's face to flush with anger, but her brother placed a restraining hand on her arm. "We wish you well in your endeavors, Mrs. Blackwood," he said neutrally before steering his sister away. "Thornton doesn't appreciate being made the villain in town gossip," Jackson explained quietly as they watched the siblings depart. "Your dignified handling of the situation puts him at a disadvantage he's not accustomed to experiencing." "I have no desire to create enemies," Caroline replied. "But neither will I apologize for building a life different from what was initially planned." Jackson's expression warmed. "No apologies necessary. Some of the best journeys begin with an unexpected detour." The days settled into a rhythm as spring advanced toward summer. Mornings were devoted to the triplets, whose personalities emerged more distinctly each day. Thomas the observer, taking everything in with serious concentration. James the adventurer, first to attempt rolling over and reaching for objects. Lily the communicator, whose coos and babbles seemed perpetually on the verge of becoming words. Afternoons brought students to the cottage, where Caroline had established a small classroom in the main living area. The Henderson children arrived by wagon 3 times weekly, their natural intelligence finally finding proper direction under her guidance. 2 afternoons were dedicated to the Wilson girls, whose musical ability flourished with formal instruction on the small piano that had indeed arrived, as Jackson promised. Evenings twice weekly were reserved for the ranch hands, whose initial skepticism about book learning quickly gave way to genuine enthusiasm as they recognized the practical advantages of literacy and basic mathematics. Their respect for Mrs. B, as they took to calling her, grew when she adapted her teaching to focus on skills directly relevant to their daily lives, reading contracts and cattle prices, calculating acreage and feed requirements, writing letters to distant family members. Jackson himself sometimes attended these sessions not as supervisor but as participant, working alongside his men with no pretension of superiority despite his own considerable education. Caroline found his humility both surprising and admirable, particularly when contrasted with the social hierarchies that had dominated her life in Philadelphia. One evening in late May, after the ranch hands had departed and the triplets were finally sleeping, Caroline sat on the porch, enjoying the coolness that followed a warm day. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced Jackson's arrival, now a common occurrence, as he often stopped by to check on their welfare or deliver news from town. "The Wilsons have invited you to dinner next Saturday," he announced without preamble, as he settled into what had become his chair. A significant social step they rarely entertained beyond their Denver connections. "Margaret Wilson mentioned the possibility," Caroline replied. "She seems pleased with her daughter's progress." "As she should be. Abigail played for me yesterday when I delivered a contract to her father. Remarkable improvement in just a few weeks." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. These quiet moments had become increasingly common between them, a shared appreciation for peaceful reflection that required no conversation to fill it. "I received a letter from Philadelphia today," Caroline said eventually. From my late husband's aunt, the only family connection remaining there. Jackson waited, sensing there was more to the story. She expressed her disapproval of my reckless Western adventure and suggested I return to Philadelphia, where she might find me a position as a companion to an elderly relative of hers. Caroline couldn't keep the edge from her voice. A generous offer, considering she made no effort to assist when Frederick died, leaving me with mounting debts and 3 newborns. "And your response?" Jackson asked quietly. "I haven't composed it yet, but I plan to politely decline. The triplets are thriving here. My teaching practice grows weekly. I've earned more in the past month than I would in 3 as someone's companion." She turned to look at him directly in the fading light. "For the first time since becoming a widow, I feel as though I'm building something, rather than merely surviving." Jackson nodded, understanding evident in his expression. "Your father once told me that the true measure of education isn't memorized, facts or social polish, but developing the capacity to construct a meaningful life from whatever materials circumstance provides." "That sounds very much like him," Caroline said softly, "though I doubt he imagined his daughter constructing a life in a former foreman's cottage in Colorado territory." "I think he'd be proud of your courage," Jackson countered. "Your father valued resilience above most virtues. He certainly demanded it from his students." "You were his favorite, you know," Caroline revealed, the memories surfacing unexpectedly. "He spoke of you often after you left. The scholarship student whose natural brilliance exceeded that of his wealthiest pupils." Jackson's expression registered surprise. "I didn't know that. He was always correct in his assessments of my work, but rarely effusive with praise." "Not to your face, perhaps, but I overheard him telling my mother that you would make a significant mark on the world if given half a chance." She smiled at the memory. "It seems his prediction was accurate, though perhaps not in the way he envisioned." The conversation shifted to reminiscences of the academy, amusing incidents involving pompous students, Caroline's mother sneaking extra food to the boarding students, her father's infamous pop quizzes that terrified even the best-prepared pupils. They were still laughing over shared memories when a cry from inside indicated that at least one of the triplets had awakened. "I should go," Jackson said, rising immediately. "Same time Thursday for the ranch hands lesson?" Caroline nodded, already moving toward the door. "We'll be covering letter writing. Several of the men have mentioned family back east they haven't communicated with in years." "I look forward to it," Jackson replied, and she believed he genuinely did. As spring blossomed fully into summer, Caroline's position in the community solidified. What had begun as curiosity about the mail-order bride with triplets evolved into respect for the dedicated teacher who had established herself independently after Thornton's rejection. Invitations arrived regularly for community gatherings, though Caroline accepted selectively, mindful of the triplets' needs and her own energy reserves. The Wilson dinner proved particularly significant, as it introduced Caroline to several prominent families from neighboring communities who subsequently arranged for their children to join her growing roster of students. By July, she had established a small but thriving educational practice that provided comfortably for her family's needs. Through it all, Jackson's support remained constant yet unobtrusive. He seemed to instinctively understand when practical assistance was welcome and when Caroline needed to demonstrate her independence. They developed an easy companionship based on mutual respect and shared values, their interactions characterized by thoughtful conversation and increasingly frequent laughter. Only Martha seemed to recognize the subtle shift occurring between them, though she kept her observations mostly to herself. "Jackson smiles more these days," she remarked casually one afternoon while helping Caroline with the triplets' laundry. "Reminds me of when he and Frank first established the ranch, that sense of building something worthwhile." Caroline deflected the implicit question. He's been extraordinarily kind to us all. The opportunities he's provided have made an immeasurable difference. Martha responded non-committally. Kind he certainly is. But there's kindness, and then there's riding out in a thunderstorm to bring medicine when James had that fever, or carving those wooden animals the triplets love so much, or appearing every Sunday to escort you all to church, regardless of whatever ranch crisis might be brewing. She hung a tiny shirt on the line with particular emphasis. That goes beyond kindness in my estimation. Before Caroline could formulate a response, hoofbeats announced a rider approaching at speed. Jackson appeared, his expression unusually serious as he dismounted. Thornton's sister has taken ill suddenly, he announced without preamble. Possible appendicitis. Doc Miller is away delivering the Peterson baby, and Thornton is in Denver on business. They're asking if you might attend her until the doctor returns. Carolyn's surprise must have shown on her face as Jackson continued quickly. Apparently, Miss Thornton mentioned that you had nursing experience during a fever outbreak at your school in Philadelphia. The housekeeper remembered and suggested sending for you. It was true that Caroline had assisted the school physician during a scarlet fever outbreak that had claimed 2 students despite their best efforts. The experience had been harrowing but educational, teaching her more about practical medicine than most women of her background ever learned. "Of course I'll go," she said immediately, maternal instinct overriding any hesitation about helping someone who had been openly disdainful of her. "But the triplets—" "I'll stay with them," Martha interjected firmly. "Daniel can ride to town for anything we need." Within minutes, Caroline had gathered basic supplies, clean cloths, a bottle of witch hazel, her small kit of herbal remedies, and written detailed instructions for the triplets' care. Jackson insisted on accompanying her, and they rode together toward town, Caroline on a gentle mare that was among the first gifts she had accepted from the Triple F. "This is unexpected," she admitted as they rode. "Olivia Thornton has made no secret of her disapproval of my situation." "Pain has a way of reshuffling priorities," Jackson replied, "and whatever her personal feelings, even Miss Thornton recognizes competence when needed." The Thornton residence proved to be the largest home in Prosperity Springs, a 2-story structure with elaborate woodwork and imported glass windows that spoke of Eastern wealth transplanted to the frontier. The housekeeper, a harried-looking woman named Mrs. Wheeler, ushered them immediately upstairs to Olivia's bedroom. Caroline found the normally composed woman curled in agony, her face ghostly pale against the fine linen pillowcases. Setting aside any personal history, Caroline moved immediately into the calm efficiency she had developed during the school epidemic. "Miss Thornton, I need to examine your abdomen to determine the nature of your pain," she explained gently. "Mr. Foster will wait outside, and Mrs. Wheeler will assist me." The examination confirmed Caroline's suspicions: the telltale tenderness in the lower right quadrant, the fever, the nausea that Olivia had been experiencing since morning. All pointed to an inflamed appendix, a dangerous condition that required immediate medical attention. "When do you expect Dr. Miller to return?" Caroline asked Mrs. Wheeler as she bathed Olivia's face with cool water. "Not until tomorrow, at earliest. The Peterson farm is nearly 15 miles out, and Mrs. Peterson's labors are always difficult." Caroline considered their limited options. "We need to reduce the inflammation and fever until the doctor can attend her. I'll need ice if available, clean cloths, willow bark tea, and someone must maintain watch throughout the night." "I'll arrange it all," Mrs. Wheeler promised, clearly relieved to have specific instructions. Through the long afternoon and into evening, Caroline attended Olivia with methodical care, applying cold compresses to reduce inflammation, administering willow bark tea for pain and fever, monitoring vital signs for any indication of worsening. Jackson remained downstairs, handling communications with neighbors and making arrangements for ice to be brought from the ice house at the hotel. As midnight approached with no sign of the doctor, Caroline settled into a chair beside Olivia's. In bed for what promised to be a long vigil, to her surprise, her patient reached out a weak hand to grasp hers. "Why are you helping me?" Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "After how I've treated you." "Because you need help," Caroline replied simply. "The rest is irrelevant at the moment." Olivia's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "I've been unkind, deliberately so." "Rest now," Caroline said gently. "We can discuss personal matters when you're recovered." But Olivia seemed determined to speak, while fever and pain had stripped away her usual defenses. "I resented you from the moment you stepped off that train. So young, with those beautiful babies, capturing everyone's immediate sympathy and attention." Her grip on Caroline's hand tightened. "And then Jackson Foster, who never spared me a second glance despite years of hints, suddenly couldn't do enough for the pretty young widow from Philadelphia." The admission stunned Caroline into momentary silence. "Miss Thornton, I assure you—" "No assurance is necessary," Olivia interrupted, grimacing as pain rolled through her. "I see clearly now what I was too proud to admit before. Jackson looks at you the way my father once looked at my mother, as though you hang the stars each night and raise the sun each morning. No amount of social position or inheritance could compete with that." Before Caroline could formulate a response to this extraordinary statement, footsteps on the stairs announced Jackson's return. He entered carrying a bucket of ice chips, his expression concerned. "How is she?" "Holding steady," Caroline replied, professional demeanor firmly in place despite her inner turmoil at Olivia's words. "The ice will help reduce the inflammation. Thank you for arranging it." As dawn approached, Dr. Miller finally returned to town and arrived promptly at the Thornton residence. After examining Olivia and consulting with Caroline about the care provided overnight, he confirmed the diagnosis of appendicitis. "You've done everything correctly, Mrs. Blackwood," he said with professional approval. "The cold compresses likely prevented a rupture. I'm prepared to operate now that I'm here, but your nursing care almost certainly saved Miss Thornton's life." Exhausted but relieved, Caroline allowed Jackson to escort her home as the first rays of sunlight touched the distant mountains. They rode in companionable silence for much of the journey, both tired from the night's vigil. "You were extraordinary," Jackson said finally as the Triple F came into view. "The calm confidence with which you handled everything. It was remarkable to witness." "My father believed education should be practical as well as intellectual," Caroline replied modestly. "The nursing skills I learned during the fever outbreak proved useful beyond that immediate crisis." Jackson reined his horse to a stop, prompting Caroline to do the same. In the golden morning light, his expression was uncommonly vulnerable. "Caroline, I've been thinking—" Whatever he intended to say was interrupted by the sight of Martha hurrying from the cottage, waving urgently. "James has a fever," she called as they approached. "Started just after midnight. I've been up with him all night." All thoughts of personal matters vanished as Caroline dismounted and rushed inside to find her son, flushed and listless in his cradle, his normally active limbs unnaturally still. The peaceful moment between her and Jackson dissolved in the face of this new crisis, leaving unspoken words hanging in the clear mountain air. Caroline's world narrowed to the small, fevered body of her son as she examined him with trembling hands that belied her outward calm. James's skin burned beneath her touch, his normally bright eyes glassy and unfocused. She had witnessed enough childhood illness in Philadelphia to recognize the seriousness of his condition, though the cause remained unclear. "How long has he been like this?" she asked Martha, who hovered anxiously nearby, Thomas and Lily watching wide-eyed from their shared cradle. "The fever rose quickly after midnight," Martha replied. "I've been giving him cool baths as you showed me, but it keeps returning stronger each time." Jackson stepped forward, his expression grave. "I'll ride for Dr. Miller immediately. He should be finished with Miss Thornton's procedure by now." Caroline nodded gratefully, already moving to prepare willow bark tea and cold compresses. "Tell him James has rapid breathing, high fever, and unusual lethargy. He's not coughing, which rules out croup, but I'm concerned about—" She stopped, unwilling to voice her worst fears about childhood diseases that could claim a baby within hours. "I'll bring him back regardless of what other patients await," Jackson promised, already heading for the door. The decisive confidence in his voice provided a momentary anchor amidst Caroline's rising panic. The hours that followed tested the limits of Caroline's composure as she fought to control James's fever through cool baths and damp cloths, while maintaining a semblance of normalcy for Thomas and Lily, who sensed their mother's distress and responded with increasing fussiness. Martha proved invaluable, tending the healthy babies, while Caroline focused exclusively on James, whose small body seemed to burn hotter with each passing hour despite her best efforts. By mid-afternoon, Caroline had moved a rocking chair next to the wash basin, allowing her to keep James's body partially immersed in cooling water while maintaining the gentle motion that had always soothed him. She sang softly, the same lullabies she had learned from her own mother years before, her voice steady even as tears occasionally slipped down her cheeks. "You must fight, my brave one," she whispered when Martha stepped outside to fetch more well water. "You've journeyed too far and overcome too much to surrender now." The sound of approaching horses broke through her fog of worry. Moments later, Jackson burst through the door with Dr. Miller close behind, both men dusty from hard riding. The doctor moved immediately to Caroline's side, his experienced hands gently taking James from her arms as he performed a thorough examination. "How long has he been feverish?" he asked, pressing a stethoscope to the baby's chest. "Approximately 15 hours," Caroline replied, forcing herself to provide clear, factual information rather than succumbing to the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "The fever rises despite cooling baths, but there's no cough, no visible rash, and no unusual stiffness in his neck." Dr. Miller nodded approvingly at her methodical observations. "Has he been exposed to anyone ill recently? Any visitors from outside the ranch?" Caroline started to shake her head, then froze as realization dawned. "Miss Thornton, I spent hours at her bedside last night. Could I have brought something back? Unlikely from appendicitis itself, but possible from something else in that household." The doctor continued his examination, gently palpating James's abdomen and checking inside his ears and throat. His expression remained neutral, but Caroline detected the slight relaxation of his shoulders that suggested he had eliminated the worst possibilities. "Not meningitis or scarlet fever," he announced finally. "I believe we're dealing with a severe ear infection that's caused the high fever. Common in infants his age, and concerning certainly, but treatable." Relief nearly buckled Caroline's knees. Jackson moved instinctively to her side, his hand finding her elbow to steady her. Dr. Miller opened his medical bag, retrieving several small bottles and clean bandages. "I'll prepare eardrops with a mixture of mullein oil and garlic to fight the infection. Continue the cooling baths for the fever, and I'll leave willow bark powder for a milder tea than what you've been using, more appropriate for an infant his size." As the doctor worked, Jackson quietly organized food and fresh water, anticipating needs before they were voiced. He sent Daniel to inform the Hendersons that tomorrow's tutoring session would be postponed and dispatched another ranch hand to the Wilsons with a similar message. These practical arrangements allowed Caroline to focus entirely on James and the doctor's instructions for his care. "I'll return tomorrow morning," Dr. Miller promised as he prepared to leave. The next 12 hours are critical for controlling the fever, but I'm optimistic given your prompt and appropriate care thus far. After the doctor's departure, Caroline sat in the rocking chair with James cradled against her chest, administering the prescribed drops with a steady hand while singing softly to distract him from the discomfort. The baby whimpered, but remained unusually subdued, his normally active limbs limp with exhaustion from fighting the fever. "You should eat something," Jackson urged gently, placing a bowl of Martha's hearty stew beside her. "You can't care for him properly if you neglect yourself." The simple practicality of his concern penetrated Caroline's fog of worry. She nodded, allowing him to take James briefly, while she forced down several spoonfuls of stew, recognizing the wisdom in his words, despite her lack of appetite. "Thank you," she said simply as she reclaimed her son, "for bringing the doctor so quickly, for handling all the arrangements, for—" She struggled to articulate the depth of her gratitude for his steady presence during this crisis. "No thanks necessary," Jackson replied, his green eyes serious as they met hers. "This is what He stopped himself, then continued more carefully. "This is what friends do for one another." Night fell, bringing cooler air, but no respite. From James's fever, Martha reluctantly departed to tend to responsibilities at the main house, promising to return at dawn. Caroline established a rotation of cooling baths every hour, maintaining careful notes on temperature changes and responses to the eardrops and willowbark tea Dr. Miller had prepared. To her surprise, Jackson showed no inclination to leave. He stoked the fire, prepared fresh cloths for the cooling baths, and cared for Thomas and Lily with unexpected competence, somehow anticipating their needs almost as effectively as Caroline herself. When both healthy babies finally succumbed to sleep, he settled in a chair opposite Caroline's rocker, his presence a silent bulwark against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her in the darkest hours of night. "You should rest," she suggested, as midnight approached, noting the fatigue evident in his posture. "You've been awake for nearly 2 days between Miss Thornton's crisis and this one." "As have you," he countered. "I'll rest when James shows improvement." His quiet determination to share her vigil touched something deep within Caroline. Throughout Frederick's illness and death, she had faced each crisis fundamentally alone, making decisions and bearing burdens with no true partner to lean upon. Frederick's family had offered financial assistance but little personal support, maintaining the emotional distance that had characterized their arranged marriage from its beginning. Now, watching Jackson gently dampen a fresh cloth for James's forehead, she recognized the profound difference between obligation and genuine caring. His actions stemmed not from duty or social expectation, but from authentic concern for her child's welfare, a distinction that became increasingly meaningful as the night progressed. Near dawn, Caroline noticed a subtle change in James's breathing, the labored quality giving way to deeper, more natural inhalations. Placing her hand on his forehead, she detected the first significant reduction in temperature since the fever began. "Jackson," she whispered, afraid to trust her own assessment. "I think his fever's breaking." Jackson moved immediately to her side, his own hand gently touching the baby's cheek. "Definitely cooler," he confirmed, relief evident in his voice. "His color looks better too." As morning light filtered through the cottage windows, James opened his eyes, his gaze clearer than it had been for nearly 24 hours. When he managed a weak smile at the sight of his mother's face, tears of relief spilled down Caroline's cheeks. "There's my brave boy," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "I knew you wouldn't surrender without a fight." Dr. Miller arrived as promised, his examination confirming what Caroline's maternal instinct had already detected. James had turned the corner toward recovery. "The infection is responding to treatment," he announced with satisfaction. "Continue the eardrops for 5 more days, and he should make a complete recovery." After the doctor departed, Caroline finally succumbed to the exhaustion she had been fighting. Jackson insisted she sleep while he watched over all 3 babies, promising to wake her immediately if James showed any signs of returning fever. "You've been without proper rest for nearly 2 days, he pointed out when she hesitated. "A few hours of sleep will restore your strength for whatever challenges come next." Too weary to argue, Caroline surrendered to his logic, retreating to her bedroom with the door ajar so she could hear any distress from the main room. She had intended merely to rest briefly, but the accumulated strain of fear and vigilance claimed her instantly, plunging her into deep, dreamless sleep. When she woke, the angle of sunlight suggested late afternoon. Alarmed at having slept so long, she hurried into the main room to find an unexpected scene of domestic tranquility. Martha sat in the rocking chair with Thomas, while Jackson reclined on the small sofa with both James and Lily nestled against his chest, all 3 sleeping peacefully. Martha raised a finger to her lips, then whispered, "James took some diluted milk an hour ago, the first he's kept down since falling ill. His fever hasn't returned." Relief washed through Caroline as she observed her son's improved color and relaxed posture. More surprising was the entirely natural way he and Lily had settled against Jackson, their complete trust in his protection evident even in sleep. "Jackson refused to leave them even after I returned," Martha continued softly. "Said he'd promised he'd watch over them until you woke, and a foster never breaks his word." The simple statement carried weight beyond its surface meaning. Caroline had encountered many broken promises since Frederick's death, assurances of assistance that evaporated in the face of inconvenience, pledges of support that proved conditional or temporary. Jackson's steadfast reliability stood in stark contrast, establishing a foundation of trust she had almost forgotten could exist between adults. Over the next few days, James recovered his strength with the resilience typical of healthy infants. By week's end, he had returned to his usual active self, seemingly determined to compensate for lost time by increased volume and energy. Caroline gradually resumed her teaching schedule, though Jackson insisted she reduce her workload temporarily to conserve strength after the ordeal. One evening, after the triplets were settled for the night, Caroline sat on the porch enjoying the cooler air that followed a particularly warm July day. The sound of a horse approaching announced Jackson's arrival, now such a familiar occurrence, that she found herself listening for it each evening, her day feeling somehow incomplete without their customary conversation. "James seems fully recovered," he observed as he settled beside her, passing over a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Mrs. Wilson sent fresh cinnamon rolls when she heard you were resuming her daughter's lessons tomorrow." Caroline accepted the gift with a smile. "The community's kindness continues to surprise me. Mrs. Henderson brought a chicken soup that apparently cures everything from earaches to broken hearts, and even Olivia Thornton sent a small blanket with remarkably fine embroidery." "Miss Thornton's recovery progresses well," Jackson commented. "Dr. Miller says your prompt care prevented complications that could have been fatal." "I only did what anyone with basic knowledge would have done," Caroline demurred. "That's precisely the point," Jackson replied. "Few here have such knowledge. Your education and experience quite literally saved her life, a fact not lost on the Thorntons, despite their previous attitude toward you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk. Caroline found herself reflecting on how much had changed since her arrival in Prosperity Springs just 3 months earlier. What had begun as desperation, a last-ditch effort to secure stability through marriage to a stranger, had transformed into something she hadn't dared imagine, genuine independence built on her own skills and character rather than a wedding band. "I received a letter from Josiah Thornton today," Jackson said eventually, interrupting her thoughts. "He's officially withdrawn his opposition to your teaching contract with the town council. They've approved funding for a proper schoolhouse to be built by winter, with you as the primary instructor." Caroline's eyes widened in surprise. "That's unexpected. I thought Mr. Thornton would maintain his resistance out of pride, if nothing else." "Nearly losing his sister has apparently shifted his perspective," Jackson replied. "The letter mentioned something about recognizing the value of practical skills over social considerations." "A schoolhouse," Caroline murmured, envisioning the possibilities such a permanent arrangement would create. "That would allow for more students, a proper curriculum, and greater security for you and the triplets," Jackson added. "The position comes with a teacher's residence adjacent to the schoolhouse, more convenient to town than the cottage here." Something in his tone caught Caroline's attention. "You think I should accept this arrangement?" "I think it represents the independence you've worked toward," he replied carefully. "The opportunity to establish yourself professionally without reliance on anyone's charity or goodwill." Caroline studied his expression in the fading light, detecting an undercurrent of emotion beneath his practical assessment. "Yet I sense reservation in your voice." Jackson was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his words emerged with deliberate care. "Selfish considerations shouldn't influence your decision. What's best for you and the children must take priority." "What selfish considerations might those be?" Caroline pressed gently. He turned to face her directly, vulnerability evident in his expression. "I've grown accustomed to your presence here, to our conversations, to watching the triplets discover the world. The cottage would feel emptier without you in it." The simple admission stirred something Caroline had been carefully guarding since Frederick's death, the capacity for emotional attachment beyond her children. She had accepted Jackson's friendship and assistance with gratitude, but had deliberately avoided examining the deeper currents developing between them. "James's illness forced me to confront something I've been avoiding," she admitted quietly. "When he was at his worst, and you rode for the doctor without hesitation, when you stayed through the night despite your own exhaustion." She paused, gathering courage for complete honesty. "I realized that somehow, without intending it, the triplets and I have come to rely on you in ways that go beyond practical assistance or business arrangements." A cautious hope kindled in Jackson's eyes. "And does that realization trouble you?" "It should," Caroline acknowledged. "Conventional wisdom would suggest a widow with 3 infants should focus exclusively on security and stability, not other considerations. Conventional wisdom rarely accounts for the unexpected," Jackson replied, his voice deepening slightly. "For the possibility that security and deeper attachments might develop simultaneously." The unspoken question hung between them, neither quite ready to articulate the natural progression of their evolving relationship. After a moment, Caroline returned to safer ground. The teaching position and residence in town would certainly offer practical advantages, she reflected. Shorter journeys for the Henderson children, easier access to Dr. Miller should another illness arise. All valid considerations, Jackson agreed, accepting her temporary retreat from more personal matters. The decision should be yours alone, based on what best serves your needs and aspirations. Before Caroline could respond, the sound of approaching horses broke the evening stillness. 2 riders appeared in the gathering darkness, moving at a speed that suggested urgency. Jackson rose immediately, his posture shifting to alertness as he recognized the lead rider as Callahan, the Triple F foreman. "Mr. Foster," Callahan called as he reined to a stop. "Trouble at the north pasture. Lightning hit the old oak and the fire's spreading toward the summer grazing land. All hands are responding, but we need direction on whether to focus on saving the cattle or fighting the fire directly." Jackson's expression shifted instantly from personal reflection to decisive leadership. "We'll need to do both simultaneously. Divide the men into 2 groups." He turned briefly to Caroline. "I'm sorry, but I must go." "Of course," she replied immediately. "Be careful." With a quick nod of acknowledgement, he mounted his horse and rode away with the foreman, their figures quickly disappearing into the darkness. Caroline remained on the porch long after they'd gone, pondering the interrupted conversation and all it suggested about possible futures neither of them had openly acknowledged. The following week brought a flurry of activity as news of the approved schoolhouse spread through the community. Additional families approached Caroline about enrollment, curriculum questions, and potential start dates for formal classes. The town council sent official documentation outlining her contract terms, compensation, and responsibilities, all significantly more generous than she had anticipated. Jackson remained conspicuously absent during this period, the fire crisis apparently requiring his full attention at the furthest reaches of Triple F property. Martha provided updates during her regular visits, describing the battle against flames that threatened not only ranchland, but several neighboring properties as well. "Jackson has the men working in shifts around the clock," she explained, 4 days after his abrupt departure. "They've managed to save most of the herd, but they're still fighting hotspots in the timber stands near the North Ridge." "No injuries, I hope?" Caroline asked, attempting to maintain a tone of general concern rather than the specific worry that had kept her awake for several nights. "Minor burns and exhaustion mostly," Martha replied, her knowing gaze suggesting she recognized the depth of Caroline's interest. "Jackson took a fall when his horse spooked near a burning deadfall, but nothing serious according to Callahan's report this morning." Caroline busied herself with the triplets to conceal her reaction to this information. The thought of Jackson, injured even slightly, created an uncomfortable tightness in her chest that confirmed what she had been reluctant to fully acknowledge. Her feelings for him had evolved far beyond gratitude or friendship. On the 6th day following the fire's outbreak, Caroline sat at the small desk in her bedroom, composing her official acceptance of the teaching position. The document required her signature on several pages, each representing different aspects of her upcoming responsibilities to the town of Prosperity Springs. As she reviewed the terms, she found herself repeatedly distracted by the implications of relocating to town, specifically how it would affect the tentative personal connection forming between herself and Jackson. A knock at the cottage door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Jackson himself standing on the porch, looking exhausted and smoke-stained, but otherwise whole. Relief surged through her with unexpected intensity. "You're back," she said simply, stepping aside to let him enter. "Martha said you were injured." "Nothing worth mentioning," he replied, though she noticed he favored his left side slightly as he moved. "The fire's finally contained. We lost some timber and about 40 acres of grazing land, but all the hands are safe and most of the herd survived." His gaze moved to the triplets playing on their blanket in the main room, a smile transforming his tired features. "They look well. James shows no lingering effects from his illness." "None at all," Caroline confirmed. "Dr. Miller says he's completely recovered." Jackson knelt beside the blanket despite his obvious exhaustion, greeting each baby individually. Thomas solemnly offered a wooden block, which Jackson accepted with appropriate gravity. James babbled enthusiastically, reaching for the bandana around Jackson's neck. Lily simply gazed at him with the adoring expression she reserved for her favorite people, a category in which Jackson had clearly established permanent membership. "I've missed them," he admitted, looking up at Caroline with unguarded emotion. And you? The nights fighting the fire were long, but the silence was longer. I've grown accustomed to our evening conversations. The simple honesty of his statement eliminated Caroline's carefully constructed barriers. I've missed you too, she confessed. More than I expected. Something shifted in Jackson's expression. Hope mingled with uncertainty. He rose slowly, wincing slightly at the movement. Martha mentioned the town council sent the teaching contract for your review. Yes, I was just signing the acceptance, Caroline confirmed, gesturing toward her desk visible through the bedroom doorway. The terms are quite generous. You've decided to accept the position then, and the residence in town? The question carried weight beyond its surface meaning. Caroline chose her words carefully, understanding that their conversation had moved beyond professional considerations into territory that would shape their future interactions. The position itself, yes, the separate residence. She hesitated, then continued with deliberate precision. That aspect requires further consideration. There are personal factors that weren't relevant when I first arrived in Prosperity Springs. Understanding dawned in Jackson's eyes, followed by something deeper that caused his normally composed features to soften remarkably. Personal factors, he repeated quietly. Might those factors include the relationship that's been developing between us these past months? They might, Caroline acknowledged, her heart beating faster despite her outward calm, though we've been careful not to define that relationship explicitly. Jackson moved closer, his gaze never leaving hers. Perhaps it's time for that definition. For both our sakes. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. When you first arrived in Prosperity Springs, I offered assistance out of respect for your father and recognition of your difficult circumstances. But what began as obligation has evolved into something far more significant, at least for me. For me as well, Caroline admitted softly, though I've been reluctant to acknowledge it even to myself. Widowhood with 3 infants hardly seems the appropriate circumstance for. She trailed off, uncertain how to characterize what had developed between them. For falling in love again, Jackson suggested, his directness both startling and oddly comforting. Perhaps not according to conventional wisdom, but I've found that the heart rarely consults social propriety before choosing its path. The T-die word love hung between them, simultaneously frightening and exhilarating in its implications. Caroline had married Frederick with affection and respect, but without the deeper emotional connection that poets celebrated. What she felt for Jackson, the magnetic pull that made his presence essential to her sense of well-being, the way his opinions mattered to her decision-making, the natural integration of his life with hers, existed in an entirely different dimension. I never expected this, she confessed. When I came west, I sought security and stability for my children through a practical arrangement with a stranger. Instead, I found independence, community, and... She looked directly into his eyes. Feelings I never anticipated experiencing, again after Frederick's death. Jackson's expression reflected the same wonder she felt at this unexpected development in both their lives. When I recognized you at the station that day, I thought it was merely an extraordinary coincidence, the daughter of my mentor appearing in my small corner of the world. I had no notion that the connection would evolve as it has. Nor did I, Caroline agreed. Yet here we are. A cry from the blanket interrupted their moment of recognition as James, always sensitive to emotional undercurrents, demanded attention. Caroline moved to lift him, but Jackson stepped forward. "May I?" he asked, reaching for the fussing baby. At her nod, he scooped James up with practiced ease, settling the child against his shoulder with natural confidence that spoke of these months of regular interaction. "There now, young man. Your timing needs refinement, but your instincts are sound. Important conversations shouldn't proceed too quickly. James quieted immediately against Jackson's shoulder, his small hand gripping the man's shirt with possessive determination. The sight of her son so comfortable in Jackson's arms crystallized something Caroline had been gradually accepting. The triplets had formed their own attachments to this man who had entered their lives at its most vulnerable juncture. "They love you," she said softly, watching as Thomas and Lily now clamored for similar attention. "All three of them. They light up when you enter a room in a way they do with no one else besides me." Jackson gazed at the triplets with undisguised affection, a smile softening his weathered features. "They've become precious to me in ways I never anticipated," he admitted, gently bouncing James while Thomas and Lily watched expectantly from their blanket. "When I established the Triple F, I envisioned building a legacy of land and cattle, something tangible to pass down through generations. I never considered that the most meaningful legacy might involve smaller, more personal treasures." The tenderness in his voice touched something deep within Caroline. For months, she had focused primarily on practical matters, securing shelter, establishing her teaching practice, ensuring the triplets' physical well-being. The emotional dimension of their situation, the children's need for a father figure, her own longing for companionship beyond motherhood, had remained secondary out of necessity. "We should discuss this more thoroughly," she suggested, gathering her courage to address directly what had been building between them. "But perhaps after you've had a chance to rest, you look exhausted from the firefighting efforts." Jackson nodded, reluctantly returning James to the blanket with his siblings. "You're right, as usual. Clear minds make better decisions, and mine is admittedly foggy from lack of sleep." His expression grew more serious. "But I don't want to leave our conversation unfinished for too long. Some matters, once acknowledged, deserve prompt resolution." "Tomorrow evening," Caroline suggested, "after the triplets are asleep, we could talk without interruption." "Tomorrow evening," he agreed, moving toward the door with obvious reluctance to depart despite his fatigue. At the threshold, he paused, turning back to her with quiet intensity. "Caroline, whatever comes of our discussion, please know that these past months have been among the most meaningful of my life." After his departure, Caroline moved through her evening routine in a state of heightened awareness, her mind cataloguing all the ways Jackson Foster had become essential to her. In family's life, it wasn't just the practical assistance or even his steady presence during crises like James's illness. It was the way he respected her independence while offering genuine partnership, the way he engaged with the triplets not as a duty, but with authentic joy. The way their conversations ranged from philosophy to ranching methods to childhood memories, each exchange deepening their understanding of one another. When had gratitude and friendship evolved into deeper attachment? Perhaps during those evening conversations on the porch, watching fireflies rise from the prairie grass, or during James's illness, when Jackson's unwavering support had provided an anchor amid her fear. Or maybe the foundation had been laid years earlier at her father's academy, where a brilliant scholarship student had demonstrated the character that would later define the man. The following day passed with excruciating slowness. Caroline taught the Henderson children in the morning, their enthusiastic response to her lessons providing temporary distraction from her anticipation of the evening's conversation. The afternoon brought the Wilson girls for their piano instruction, their musical progress remarkable thanks to dedicated practice and natural talent. As twilight approached, Caroline bathed the triplets and dressed them in their nightclothes, her routine movements belying the nervous energy coursing through her. At precisely 7 o'clock, the now familiar sound of hoofbeats announced Jackson's arrival, He appeared at the door, freshly shaven, and wearing a clean shirt, his own anticipation evident in the careful attention to his appearance, despite the lingering fatigue in his eyes. "The fire crew is still monitoring hotspots," he explained as he entered, "but nothing requiring immediate concern. Cal has matters well in hand at the North Pasture." The triplets greeted him with their customary enthusiasm, Thomas solemnly offering a wooden horse, James babbling excitedly, and Lily beaming with unabashed adoration. Jackson acknowledged each child individually, his interactions reflecting the distinct relationships he had developed with each one over these months. "They should settle down soon," Caroline noted as she prepared their evening bottles. "They've been unusually active today." "Growth spurt, perhaps," Jackson suggested, lifting Thomas into his lap with practiced ease. "Mrs. Callahan mentioned her boys always became more energetic just before outgrowing their clothes." The casual domesticity of the moment struck Caroline forcefully. The natural way Jackson participated in the evening routine, his familiarity with the triplets' patterns and needs, the comfortable partnership they had developed without formal acknowledgement. This wasn't the awkward assistance of a benefactor, but the engaged involvement of someone who had chosen to become part of their lives. After the babies were finally settled in their cribs, Caroline and Jackson retreated to the porch, the evening. Air still warm but touched with the first hints of autumn crispness. For several moments they sat in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge against the darkening sky. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Caroline began finally, her hands folded in her lap to conceal their slight trembling, "about feelings developing between us that neither of us anticipated." Jackson nodded, his expression attentive, but allowing her to proceed at her own pace. "When I came to Prosperity Springs," she continued, "I believed I had closed that chapter of my life. Frederick and I had a relationship based on mutual respect and shared goals, but not." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Not the kind of connection poets describe. After his death, with 3 newborns depending entirely on me, I thought practical considerations would define my future, that Josiah Thornton might provide security and social standing, which seemed sufficient under the circumstances. A reasonable assessment, given your situation," Jackson observed quietly. "Yet here I find myself," Caroline said, meeting his gaze directly, experiencing something I never expected, feelings that transcend practical considerations entirely. "When you're away, as you were during the fire crisis, I find myself watching for your return. When decisions arise, I find myself wondering what insight you might offer. When the triplets reach new milestones, my first instinct is to share that joy with you." The vulnerability of her admission hung in the air between them. Jackson reached across the space, separating their chairs, his hand covering hers with gentle warmth. "I once believed that success meant achieving specific benchmarks," he responded, his deep voice resonating in the evening stillness. "Acquiring land, expanding the herd, establishing financial security, all measurable, tangible goals. I pursued them with single-minded determination, building the Triple F into what it is today." He paused, his thumb tracing a small circle on the back of her hand. Yet despite achieving those goals, something fundamental was missing. I recognized it most clearly during the darkest hours fighting the fire this past week. As we struggled to protect what I'd spent years building, I realized that without you and the triplets to share it with, the ranch's significance diminished considerably. The directness of his statement stole Caroline's breath momentarily. "Jackson, please," he interrupted gently. "Allow me to finish while my courage remains intact." At her nod, he continued, "These past months have transformed my understanding of what constitutes genuine success. It isn't measured in acres or cattle or bank accounts, but in moments of authentic connection. Thomas offering me his wooden blocks, James falling asleep against my shoulder during his illness, Lily's smile when I enter a room. His voice softened further. "And the conversations you and I share on this porch each evening." He shifted in his chair to face her more directly. "I love you, Caroline, not merely as my former mentor's daughter or as a woman who needs assistance, but as the remarkable person you are, courageous enough to journey across a continent with 3 infants, determined enough to build independence when your original plans collapsed, and generous enough to allow a confirmed bachelor rancher to become part of your family's life." The simple declaration, spoken without dramatic flourish but with profound sincerity, unlocked something Caroline had been carefully guarding since her arrival in Prosperity Springs. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition of having found something she hadn't dared seek. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission both frightening and liberating. It happened so gradually that I hardly noticed until it was already an established fact, as natural and necessary as breathing. Jackson's expression transformed at her words, hope and joy replacing the cautious restraint he had maintained throughout their evolving relationship. "Then perhaps we should consider formalizing what has already developed between us," he suggested, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "Not out of practical necessity or social convention, but because what we've found deserves proper acknowledgement." "Are you proposing marriage, Mr. Foster?" Caroline asked, a smile touching her lips despite the seriousness of the moment. "I believe I am, Mrs. Blackwood," he replied, matching her tone before growing solemn again, though not in the manner I had planned. I had intended something more formal, perhaps dinner at the hotel in town, or a proper outing to that viewpoint, overlooking the valley. "This is perfect," Caroline assured him, squeezing his hand. "Under the same stars we've watched together these past months, on the porch where our most meaningful conversations have occurred." Jackson nodded, visibly gathering his courage before sliding from his chair to one knee before her, still holding her hand in his. "Caroline Blackwood, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of allowing me to be a father to your children and a partner in whatever future we might build together?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation, certainty filling her voice. "With my whole heart, yes." Joy transformed Jackson's features as he rose, pulling her gently to her feet and into an embrace that felt simultaneously new and familiar. The culmination of months of growing attachment and the beginning of a deeper connection neither had anticipated when she first arrived in Prosperity Springs. "The triplets will be pleased," Carolyn murmured against his shoulder. "They already consider you essential to their world." "And I consider them essential to mine," Jackson replied, his arms tightening slightly around her. "All 4 of you have brought meaning to my life that I never knew was missing." They remained on the porch, talking long into the night, discussing practical arrangements and deeper hopes with equal honesty. By morning, plans had formed for a simple ceremony in 2 weeks' time, enough interval for proper announcements, but not so long as to seem unnecessarily delayed given the relationship that had already developed between them. "I should speak with Reverend Thomas today," Jackson said, as dawn light painted the eastern horizon in pink and gold. "And perhaps we should tell Martha first, before news reaches town through other channels." Caroline agreed, though she suspected Martha had anticipated this development long before they had acknowledged it themselves. The older woman's knowing glances and strategic absences had created space for their relationship to evolve naturally, her wisdom recognizing what they were only beginning to understand. When Martha arrived later that morning, ostensibly to deliver fresh eggs from the main house, her reaction to their announcement confirmed Carolyn's suspicion. "Well, it's about time," she declared, embracing them both with uncharacteristic demonstrativeness. "I began wondering if I'd need to lock you 2 in the root cellar together before you'd recognize what was plain as day to everyone else." "Everyone else," Caroline repeated, suddenly self-conscious. Martha waved a dismissive hand. "Half the county has been watching you circle each other these past months. Even Olivia Thornton mentioned it during my visit to check her recovery last week. You said she'd never seen Jackson look at anyone the way he looks at you, not in all the years she's known him." Jackson's ears reddened slightly at this revelation, but he didn't dispute Martha's assessment. "Since our intentions are apparently common knowledge already, perhaps a more expedited timeline would be appropriate," he suggested. "Next Sunday, after church services, rather than waiting 2 weeks?" "Perfect," Martha agreed before Caroline could respond. "I'll handle the arrangements for a proper celebration at the main house afterward. Nothing extravagant, but befitting the occasion." As Martha bustled off to begin preparations, Caroline found herself momentarily overwhelmed by the sudden acceleration of events. "Everything's happening so quickly," she murmured, watching Thomas attempt to roll from his back to his stomach on the blanket nearby. "Too quickly?" Jackson asked, immediately attentive to her hesitation. "We can maintain our original timeline if you prefer." Caroline considered the question seriously before shaking her head. "No, not too quickly, just differently than I expected. When I arrived in Prosperity Springs, I thought my future was determined. Marriage to Josiah Thornton, a life defined by his position and priorities. Instead, she gestured around the cottage that had become home, at the triplets playing contentedly, at Jackson himself. Instead, I found something far more genuine. A chance to build a life based on mutual respect and authentic attachment rather than mere convenience. The best journeys often involve unexpected detours," Jackson observed, repeating the sentiment he had expressed shortly after her arrival. "Though I doubt either of us could have anticipated this particular destination when you stepped off that train with 3 babies and a carpet bag." The week that followed passed in a whirlwind of preparation and community response to their announcement. News spread rapidly through Prosperity Springs, generating a wave of genuinely pleased reactions from most quarters. The Hendersons brought a hand-stitched quilt as an engagement gift. Mrs. Wilson offered her daughters musical services for the ceremony. Even Dr. Miller stopped by the cottage to express his congratulations and present a specially crafted rattle for each of the triplets. "Carved from aspen wood by a patient of mine who's quite skillful," he explained, "perfectly sized for little hands starting to grasp intentionally." Only the Thorntons maintained a conspicuous silence regarding the engagement, though Caroline encountered Olivia briefly at the general store midweek. The older woman acknowledged her with a stiff nod, her expression unreadable as she observed Caroline selecting fabric for new dresses for herself and the triplets. "Foster is a good man," Olivia said abruptly, breaking the awkward silence between them. "Better than most in these parts, including my brother in some respects." She fingered a bolt of blue calico before adding, "This would complement your coloring more effectively than the brown you've selected." The unexpected fashion advice, delivered in Olivia's characteristically brusque manner, represented an olive branch of sorts. Not quite approval, but a tacit acknowledgement of Caroline's permanent place in the community's social fabric. Caroline accepted it in the spirit intended, adjusting her fabric selection accordingly. On Saturday afternoon, as Caroline was reviewing final arrangements with Martha, a formal envelope arrived by messenger from the Thornton residence. Inside, written in Josiah's distinctive hand, was an invitation for her and Jackson to dine at his home the following evening after their wedding ceremony. "A peace offering of sorts," Jackson suggested when she showed him the invitation. "Thornton recognizes that our marriage solidifies your position in Prosperity Springs. Better to acknowledge it gracefully than maintain opposition that serves no purpose." "Should we accept?" Caroline asked, uncertain despite the apparent goodwill behind the gesture. Jackson considered the question thoughtfully. "I believe we should, not from obligation, but as a step toward community harmony. Your teaching position will involve ongoing interaction with all segments of Prosperity Springs society, including the Thorntons. Better to establish cordial relations from the outset. His practical assessment, balanced with genuine sensitivity to her comfort, exemplified the partnership they had developed, each respecting the other's perspective while working toward mutually beneficial outcomes. Caroline found herself nodding in agreement, grateful once again for his thoughtful approach to potential conflicts. Sunday dawned clear and cool, the first true hint of autumn crispness, adding brilliance to the fall flowers Martha had arranged throughout the small church. Caroline dressed the triplets in their finest clothes, the boys in matching blue suits that Mrs. Callahan had sewn from material left over from her son's wedding attire. Lily in a delicate white dress with tiny embroidered flowers that 6 ranch wives had collaborated to create in record time. For herself, Caroline chose a simple dress of deep blue silk, her one remaining fine garment from Philadelphia, carefully preserved despite limited practical use on the frontier. As she pinned her honey-brown hair into an elegant arrangement, adorned with small white flowers from the ranch garden, she caught sight of her reflection and momentarily startled at the transformation. The woman in the mirror bore little resemblance to the desperate young widow who had arrived in Prosperity Springs just 5 months earlier. That Caroline had been pale with exhaustion and worry, her expression guarded, her posture reflecting. The weight of overwhelming responsibility. This Caroline stood straighter, her complexion warmed by Colorado sunshine, her eyes bright with something beyond mere determination, genuine hope and happiness that radiated from within. A soft knock at the cottage door announced Martha's arrival to assist with final preparations. "You look beautiful," the older woman declared, her usual practicality giving way to genuine emotion. Elizabeth would have approved entirely. She touched the cameo brooch at her collar, a family heirloom Caroline had admired previously. "Which reminds me, she would want you to have this today. Foster women have worn it at their weddings for 3 generations. Tears pricked Caroline's eyes as Martha pinned the delicate brooch to her bodice. "I'm honored," she whispered, recognizing the significance of being included in family tradition. "You've brought Jackson back to life," Martha said simply. After Elizabeth and the children died in the fever epidemic, something essential in him went dormant. He functioned, built the ranch, handled responsibilities, but the spark was gone. She adjusted the brooch slightly. "You and those 3 miraculous babies reignited that spark. For that alone, you've earned your place in this family." The church filled to capacity as it seemed every resident of Prosperity Springs and surrounding ranches had determined to witness the union of the mail-order bride rejected at the station and the wealthy rancher who had recognized her from his past. The triplets, remarkably cooperative given the occasion, remained peaceful in the front pew under Martha and Daniel's watchful eyes, as Caroline walked alone down the short aisle to where Jackson waited beside Reverend Thomas. His expression as she approached would remain etched in her memory forever, wonder and joy and profound gratitude blending into something that transcended ordinary happiness. He extended his hand as she reached him, their fingers intertwining with the natural certainty that had characterized their evolving relationship. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "we gather today to witness not merely the formal union of 2 individuals, but the divine confirmation of a family already bound by love and mutual commitment." The ceremony proceeded with simple dignity, their vows exchanged with quiet conviction rather than dramatic flourish. When Jackson placed a gold band on Caroline's finger, a circle of twisted gold strands that symbolized, he whispered, the intertwining of their separate journeys into a shared path, she felt the final pieces of her new life settling into place with perfect rightness. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder, Reverend Thomas pronounced. I now present to you Mr. and Mrs. Jackson Foster. As they turned to face the congregation, Caroline's gaze fell on the triplets, all three watching with wide-eyed fascination from Martha's protective embrace. In that moment, she fully comprehended how dramatically their lives had transformed since arriving in Prosperity Springs. What had begun as desperate gamble for basic security had evolved into something far richer, a genuine family bound not by necessity but by authentic love and mutual choice. Later, as guests gathered at the main house of the Triple F for the wedding celebration, Caroline found a quiet moment with Jackson away from the festive crowd. Standing on the wide porch overlooking the ranch that would now be home to her and the triplets, she expressed the gratitude that had been building since their first encounter at the station. When I stepped off that train, she said softly, my only hope was basic survival for myself and the triplets. I never imagined finding true partnership, much less. She gestured toward the celebration where their friends and neighbors had gathered to honor their union. All of this. Jackson's arms settled around her waist, drawing her closer against his side. Life rarely unfolds according to our careful plans, he observed. Sometimes our greatest blessings emerge from what initially appear to be our most devastating setbacks. Caroline nodded, thinking of all the apparent disasters that had led to this moment: Frederick's untimely death, the rejection of her Philadelphia community, Josiah Thornton's cold dismissal upon discovering the triplets. Each painful experience had served as a stepping stone toward the genuine happiness she now experienced. When Thornton rejected me at the station, she mused, it felt like the final collapse of all my hopes. Yet without that rejection, we wouldn't be standing here today. Some journeys require unexpected detours to reach their proper destination, Jackson replied, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. And some blessings arrive in surprising packages, like a determined young woman with 3 babies who appeared in my town, precisely when I most needed reminding of life's continuing possibilities. From inside came the sound of James's distinctive cry, followed almost immediately by his siblings' voices in a familiar cascade of escalating demands. Caroline smiled at the predictable timing of their children's needs, coinciding with a moment of parental reflection. Duty calls, she said, turning toward the door. Our duty, Jackson corrected, his hand finding hers as they moved together to attend their children. Today and all the days to come. As they re-entered the celebration to find their family waiting, Caroline reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. What had begun in desperation, a mail-order bride arrangement born of necessity rather than choice, had transformed through unexpected rejection and recognition into something far more valuable: a life built on authentic connection, mutual respect, and genuine love. The future that stretched before them would undoubtedly hold challenges alongside joys, but they would face them together, not as a desperate widow and charitable benefactor, but as true partners who had discovered in each other exactly what they hadn't known they were seeking. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.